Are college football fans complaining about conference realignment hypocrites? Yes. Yes. This stuff happened back in the 1930s. The Pac-12 almost died back then. And I think hypocritical and or uninformed, Caleb, because the sport is going to be better when you have 12 average to above average matchups and you take off the Austin Peay's of the world. I don't know what Austin Peay does in that world, but in my world, it's 12 great football games for whoever you follow if you're following one of the top 36 or so teams in NCAA football. What do you think of the critics?
So they are hypocritical. You and I differ on whether or not this is better. I'm not as much of a fan of it. That's a different debate for a different time because I actually want to get to my point with the fans though. Because this struck me as another guy who our guy Josh Pate, who we interviewed at SEC Media Days, we listen to a lot. I love him. He's been critical of this too, but he said something that I think you can't hold these two thoughts in your head, which he talks about how average and mediocre the people running college football are and how they're not thinking things through. But then he touts Greg Sankey's intelligence. Well, who the heck do you think is fueling realignment? It's Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti and Brett Yormark. It's those three guys. And this is something that drives me crazy when they like to complain about the entity. Guys, the NCAA is not an entity. You can't blame the NCAA for this. They have no power, and they never had the power to stop it. As you know, Dave, the Supreme Court, if you want to blame people, you blame the Supreme Court for the 1984 ruling that gave conference autonomy for TV deals, and then you blame every conference commissioner dating back to Roy Kramer who poached other conferences. You can't hold Roy Kramer, Greg Sankey, and Tony Petitti in high esteem, but then at the same time complain about conference realignment because they're the people who are responsible for it. This very much reminds me, and this is an American public thing. Everybody hates Congress. It has an 8 to 12% approval rating, yet incumbents have a 98% reelection. And I always laugh. I'm like, y'all complain about Congress all the time, and yet you keep reelecting the guys you're complaining about. Well, we're getting this now with college football. You complain about the changes in college football, yet you put the people who are directly responsible for the changes on a pedestal. You either are for what's happening and you hold those commissioners in high esteem, or you're against what's happening and you cannot stand these commissioners. It's one or the other, but you can't have it both ways. You can't tout Roy Kramer's impact on college football and praise it, but complain about realignment. You would agree, Dave. Roy Kramer started this more than anybody by poaching Arkansas.
Roy Kramer started this and didn't know it. I've told you this story before. My very first SEC Media Days. Actually, it was like my second or third in 2000. I asked him, and I said, Commissioner, with the BCS, you've set up what could be a playoff. And he was very anti-playoff. But by having a system in which the 1 and 2 and the 3 and 4 are seeded, you're essentially building the frame for a car. And the engine was to make the decision to actually turn the key. See what I did there? And get it rolling into a playoff, which is what they did. Roy Kramer did not appreciate that and said, boy, why is your shirt inside out? No, he said, absolutely not. But he did. He set this all up. He set this up by bringing in Arkansas and South Carolina. The SEC has been the proactive one. So if you're anti-conference realignment and you're pro-SEC, you need a therapist because you could be very conflicted. It's the SEC that's pushed this from the get. If the SEC doesn't get Texas and Oklahoma, does the Big Ten really go after UCLA in Southern California?
No. It was the Big Ten did that because they needed to counter what the SEC was doing with its power. And I totally agree. The SEC did this. They started it in 1992. Again, there was conference realignment in the late 80s when a bunch of independents joined conferences, but the SEC poached a team from a major conference when they got Arkansas from the Southwest Conference, and they dissolved the Southwest Conference, which, Dave, as you know, was as elite of a conference as any of the major ones back then. And the SEC literally destroyed a conference to get one team.
May I go ahead and tell you this? In case you didn't know, Rocky Top Tom thinks that everything you've said is idiotic because he hates conference realignment. Okay, and I love it. So I'm not going to add to this conversation more than Rocky Top Tom can, who says it's on the screen. That's a false dichotomy, Caleb. It's not one or the other. What say you, Caleb Calhoun?
How is it not one or the other? If you don't like conference realignment, you should be mad at the SEC. Period. End of story. It's the SEC's fault. And it's now the Big Ten's fault, but it's mostly the SEC's fault. They started this. You should be mad at Rory Kramer. You should be mad at Mike Slive. And you should be mad at Greg Sankey.
Yep. There you go. And he didn't say, Rocky Top Tom said he didn't say idiotic. So one last update on, yes, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, and I'm with Rocky Top Tom that I don't like it. I know you like it. I don't. By the way, the person most responsible.
Oh, so you don't like you don't want to see a super conference of 36.
No, I don't. I like college football when it was 120 teams. I thought it was better. There was a pageantry and tradition and love for the sport that's going to die with realignment. I don't like the idea of the NFL model. College football is special, and you're taking away what's making it special. And so I don't like it. But I put the blame where it needs to be, which is the commissioners, and I will say every president who appointed those Supreme Court justices who ruled in favor of the conferences in 1984. Because the NCAA should have been allowed to have autonomy in dictating TV contracts. They were a governing body. Every other sports league has it.
Rocky Top Tom says, hey, I didn't say idiotic. Did you call one of our listeners an idiot, Caleb?
I never, what? No, I did not do that.
I did not know the reference. Last thing, because I love this conversation here. There's always been conference realignment, not within the context of playoff, NIL transfer portals, conference title games, media dollars directly correlated with membership, etc. I think all three of us can agree in that, right? I mean, the conference realignment I was referring to in the 30s wasn't about multi-million dollars. And really everything changed when the NCAA lost it. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're the historian here. Lost its antitrust.
1984. That's what I was talking about.
1984.
Blame the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So the conferences could go get their own TV deals. Now, college football moves so excruciatingly slow that it took a long time for things to change significantly. But that's ultimately 84, if you want to trace it back.
1984 made it natural that this was going to happen. Like that's just a fact. There was no way to stop it because of that Supreme Court ruling. And it was a stupid ruling because every other sports league gets to negotiate their own contracts and there's no antitrust violation. So it was a dumb rule too.
Agreed.